Today, the budget was fire, ready, aim. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, one of these posts covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Well, I have to tell you that the recent coverage of the budget over the last few days has been very myopic. Despite the fact that I've made a couple of posts about it, most of the mainstream media, who being pro-business of course, just lauded the Treasurer for the strategy. But I'm afraid that my perspective is rather different. And so I was rather pleased to see that more people now are stepping up and calling it out. So to start with, I want to look at some of the comments from Damien Klassen at Nucleus Wealth. Nucleus Wealth actually seems to me to be spot on in terms of its analysis. And so I think this is a really important conversation. And this is what Damien wrote. I wanted to talk about the Australian budget. I'm not seeing what the admirers are seeing. At first, he said, I was worried that I'd missed something. But the recent dovish speech by Governor Lowe suggests the Reserve Bank are seeing exactly the same as I'm seeing. 4 months ago, he said, I wrote what good government stimulus would look like. The budget didn't tick many boxes. Don't get me wrong, he said, the fiscal cannon is large enough to help. There is enough ammunition loaded into the cannon, but it has been pointed in the wrong direction, which means it will likely need to be fired again within the next 12 months. The budget, he said, has a huge focus on supply-side support. Supply is not the problem. Everyone has spare capacity. Demand is weak and needs help, not supply. Giving money to companies to hire more workers when the existing workers are not at full capacity is not going to help. Giving companies tax credits to buy new equipment doesn't help if the old equipment is running at 60% capacity. We don't manufacture in Australia anymore, so why do we want to give tax credits to companies to spend on capital? This expenditure will be heading directly offshore, helping other countries. $30 billion on company tax incentives and another $1.5 billion on a modern manufacturing strategy is, he says, a noble endeavour. But that money is going to buy Chinese, Japanese and US robots. I'm sure those countries will be grateful for the demand. Australian taxpayer-funded stimulus payments should really be targeted to support Australian jobs. Now, some companies do have a good reason to spend on capital. The reason is to automate processes so that they can reduce staff. But this is not really what the government should be going for when staring down the barrel of the highest unemployment stats for the last 90 years. The drop-off in spending is really, really large from Q3 to Q4. In Q3, government and superannuation drawdown support was over $100 billion. In the fourth quarter, it looks like being almost 70% lower, and in the first quarter of 2021, it will be 70% lower than that fourth quarter. COVID, he said, is looking increasingly like a marathon. Australian came out of the gates sprinting. We've now dropped to a slow walk, and in 3 months' time it'll be a crawl. And by the way, the insolvencies haven't happened yet, although another wave of infections is hitting Europe and the US, and demand has not recovered even in large virus-free countries. It's too early to congratulate ourselves on a job well done. Now, he asks, where is the budget support for structural change? The Australian economy was heavily reliant on education, tourism and population growth. None of these will return quickly. So you would think there are two choices. One, support the workers until those industries return, or two, help the workers get new jobs in other sectors. But he says, I'm not sure which policies are designed to do either. There are some token amounts, but I'm not expecting the average former waiter or airline stewardess to transition seamlessly into a robotics role as part of a modern manufacturing strategy. And here's the paradox of thrift. On one hand, the Australian budget takes away money from those on JobKeeper and JobSeeker who are most likely to spend the money. On the other, it gives tax cuts to higher income earners who are likely going to save it. I'm not going to argue, he said, the social case for or against, but the economic case is that already weak demand is about to be dealt another blow, and the net effect is this. There's a massive fiscal cannon with lots of ammo, but it's aimed in the wrong direction. As a result, you can expect the Reserve Bank to need to do more to make up the misfire. It is, in fact, a supply-side budget without precedent, but it's not Keynesian. You can't really call it Austrian, and it certainly isn't MMT. It probably wants to be a supply-side affair, but you would have to be an extreme trickle-down adherent to love it. The guiding economic principles are not clear at all. It will give, he says, a short-term sugar hit, followed by weak recoveries, especially for wages. Expect corporate profits to be helped by lower tax rates, but hindered by poor sales. And expect the government will have to do more, and hopefully, he says, they will aim better next time. But I wouldn't be so sure. And then over at The Age, the economics editor, Ross Gittings, takes the argument further and strategically, and he argues the budget's fiscal stimulus measures have been affected by the government's core values. There are three levers a budget can pull. First, give tax breaks and incentives to businesses in the hope that this will induce them to expand their operations, spend more on capital equipment and new employees. Second, give tax cuts or maybe one-off cash grants to individual taxpayers or welfare recipients in the hope that they will spend most of the money and therefore generate economic activity and jobs. Those two categories involve the government making transfer payments from itself to households or firms. The third category, he says, is the government spending money directly by paying someone to build a house or an expressway or to work for the government and perform some service. As a rule, economists expect direct spending to yield a higher, greater stimulus and thus have a higher multiplier effect than transfer payments. That's because all the government's spending adds to the demand for goods and services in the first round, whereas some of the money you transfer to a firm or individual may be saved rather than spent, even in the first round. Economists consider saving a leakage from the various rounds of the circular flow of income round and round the economy. Other leakages occur if the money is spent on imports rather than locally made goods and services. Still, on direct spending, if your primary goal is not so much to add to the production of goods and services, which is real gross domestic product, as to increase employment, you'd be better off directing your government spending to a labour-intensive purpose, employing, for example, an extra uni tutor or aged care nurse, for example, rather than a capital-intensive purpose, such as a new expressway. Now, let's look at how the budget's main measures fit into those three categories. It's temporary measure to allow firms an immediate write-off of the cost of new equipment, costing the revenue $26.7 billion over 4 years. It's temporary measure allowing firms to carry back current losses for tax purposes at $4.9 billion, its research and development tax incentive at $2 billion, and its temporary job maker hiring credit wage subsidy at $4 billion adds up to total revenue foregone under the first category of tax breaks to businesses of almost, wait for it, $38 billion. This is far bigger than the money going to individual taxpayers and welfare recipients in the second category, with personal tax cuts at $17.8 billion over 4 years and economic support payments to pensioners at $2.5 billion, making a total of just over $20 billion. Under the third category, direct government spending on goods and services, the main measures are various infrastructure programs, mostly via grants to state governments worth more than $10 billion over 4 years. So you see how much the budget's fiscal stimulus measures have been affected by the government's core values. No less than $38 billion goes as tax breaks to businesses. 3/4 of the $20 billion in transfers to individuals comes as tax cuts, leaving about $10 billion in direct spending going to the least labour-intensive purpose, transport infrastructure. Now, according to the budget papers, or according to the budget glosses fudged up by ministerial staffers with lots of colour photographs of good-looking punters, the government and its minions have estimated the number of jobs the top programmes are expected to create. The immediate asset write-off and loss carryback for businesses is expected to create about 50,000 jobs. Is that a lot? Well, remembering that we have a labour force of 13.5 million, it doesn't seem much at all. And dividing the 50,000 into the budgetary cost of $31.6 billion gives a cost of $632,000 per job. That's infinitely more than any of those extra workers are likely to be paid. Of course, and absolutely pathetic bang for buck. Giving money to businesses in the hope it will do wonders for jobs and growth is a classic example of trickle-down economics. Clearly, a lot of the money doesn't. But when you think about it, it's not so surprising that so much money produces so few extra jobs. Why not? Because almost all the capital equipment Australian firms buy is imported, and because firms get the concessions even if they don't buy any more equipment than they would have already been going to do. Lower income earners will get a smaller cut, which will be temporary. Frydenberg's two-class tax cut is like no other we've ever seen. Next, the budget documents imply that the personal tax cuts, worth $17.8 billion, will create a further 50,000 jobs. That works out at $356,000 per job. Still terrible bang for buck. Why so high? Too much of the tax cut is likely to be saved. And finally, the budget documents tells us that the $4 billion cost of the JobMaker hiring credit will yield around 450,000 positions for young Australians. That's a much better but still high $8,900 per position, which I take to mean that a lot of jobs won't be lasting or full-time. So what measures, he said, would have yielded better job creation value? The ones rejected as politically incorrect: big spending on social housing, a permanent increase in the job seeker unemployment benefit, or even just employing more childcare workers. And so there you have it from two separate sources. The same as I've been saying, this budget is a disaster. We are racking up huge amounts of government debt, probably up to 1.7 trillion when it's all over in a few years' time. And yet the money is not being directed into the right parts of the economy. It's frankly a highly ideological budget, and it's one that is supporting businesses at the expense of everybody else, and frankly is going to tilt the playing field even further away from the average Australian. This is a massive disaster, and frankly I think it's a disgrace. And yet, as I said earlier on, most of the mainstream media are just towing the party line and saying, well done, carry on, do a bit more later. But frankly, ideology here has got in the way of common sense, and ideology has got in the way of economic sense too. This, frankly, is a disgrace. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.